All right, let's jump right into a question that, honestly, even stumps experienced doctors. We're always told that heart attacks are all about clogged arteries, right? The more clogged, the worse it is. But what if that's not the whole picture? I mean, think about it. We hear stories about young, super fit people just collapsing from a heart attack, while at the same time some older folks with arteries that are almost completely blocked just keep on going. So that brings us to this really fascinating and kind of terrifying question. How is it possible that a tiny 20% plaque can be way more dangerous than a massive 95% one? The answer to this? Well, it changes pretty much everything we thought we knew.
So the answer boils down to one simple word: vulnerability. Turns out not all plaques are the same. It's not about size, it's about stability. On one side, you've got the vulnerable plaque. It might be small, but think of it like an angry, unstable volcano, just ready to blow. It's inflamed and super prone to rupturing. Then you have the non-vulnerable plaque. This one's often huge, maybe even calcified and hard, but it's stable. It's just sitting there. So an angiogram might light up and show this huge blockage, but it's actually that little angry one that's the real assassin. And here's the kicker, the really frightening part. Right now, we have no good way to find these vulnerable plaques in a living person. It's a diagnosis we can usually only make after the disaster has already happened.
Okay, so to really get our heads around this idea of vulnerability, we first have to take a step back and look at the classic model. The story, the blocked artery that we've all heard a million times.
This is pretty much the textbook sequence of events for a heart attack. So, step 1, plaque starts building up in the big arteries on the surface of the heart. Step 2, for some reason that plaque suddenly breaks open, it ruptures. Now the body's natural response is to see this as an injury, so for step 3, it rushes to form a blood clot, a thrombus, to patch things up. But here's where it all goes wrong. In step 4, that clot can get so big that it completely blocks the artery. And when that happens, blood flow is cut off and the heart muscle starts to die. That right there, that 4-step process, is the classic pathway.
Okay, now that final blockage, it can play out in a couple of different ways. If that clot totally seals off the artery, we're talking about a massive heart attack. It's called a STEMI. This is a 5-alarm fire, a true emergency, and it shows up on an ECG, the heart's electrical monitor, as a very specific signal called an ST elevation. But if the blockage is only partial, it's a different kind of heart attack, an NSTEMI. It's less severe, sure, but it's still incredibly dangerous. But here's the most important takeaway. Both of these emergencies, the big one and the slightly smaller one, they both start from the exact same unpredictable event, a single plaque rupturing.
All right, so we've got a pretty good handle on the devastating consequences of a plaque rupture. We know what happens after it breaks. But that brings us right to the heart of the mystery, the central enigma. Why does it rupture in the first place? And this, right here, is the huge gap in our knowledge. I mean, we know a ton about what causes plaque to form. We've studied things like diet, smoking, high blood pressure, and genetics for decades. But the actual trigger for the rupture, that one specific moment that turns a stable, quiet plaque into a ticking time bomb, that's still pretty much a black box. Why this plaque, in this person, on this particular day? That truly is the million-dollar question in cardiology.
And this is what leads to all these paradoxes that doctors see all the time. We know that smoking and high blood pressure are bad, they cause plaque, but we don't know what makes that plaque suddenly pop. It's why you can have a young, active person with just a little bit of plaque have a fatal heart attack. And at the same time, you can have an older person with an artery that's 95% blocked who's surprisingly okay. What might be happening there is that their body has had years to slowly adapt to that low blood flow, almost like it's been training itself. It's a process called ischemic preconditioning. And all of these weird situations just go to show how limited our old model of just looking at the big arteries really is. So the hunt for answers to these puzzles has really forced cardiologists to look deeper, way deeper. We have to go beyond just those big major arteries and dive into a whole new, incredibly complex frontier, the coronary microcirculation, the tiny, tiny vessels.
Now this chart right here is really revealing. We spend so much time and energy focusing on blockages in the big arteries, right? But just look at where most of the resistance to blood flow, the real traffic jam, is actually happening. It's not in those large arteries. It's overwhelmingly in the small arteries, and especially in the tiniest ones, the arterioles. This massive network of tiny vessels, this is the real gatekeeper controlling how much blood actually gets to the heart muscle.
So this micronetwork, it basically has two critical jobs. Let's call them the 2 R's. First, like we just saw, is resistance. It provides most of the resistance, acting like the main faucet controlling blood flow. The second R is regulation. This network is constantly, actively widening and narrowing to fine-tune blood flow based on what your body needs at any given moment. Now here's the key. If this incredibly important tiny network starts to malfunction, you can have all the classic symptoms of heart disease, even when an angiogram shows your main arteries are wide open.
And look, the proof for focusing on these tiny vessels isn't just a theory on a whiteboard. It comes from very real clinical syndromes, conditions that the old classic model just has no explanation for.
Let's put two of these side by side. First up, you've got something called cardiac syndrome X. The typical patient here is a postmenopausal woman. She gets chest pain when she exerts herself. You put her on a treadmill for a stress test, and it shows there's a problem, but then you do an angiogram of her big arteries, and they look totally normal. What's going on? It's dysfunction in those tiny microvessels. The good news is the prognosis is usually pretty good. Now, contrast that with cardiac syndrome Y. This is usually seen in young male smokers, and they get chest pain even when they're just sitting around, at rest. Their angiogram shows something called a slow flow phenomenon. Basically, the blood is sludging through those tiny vessels because of increased resistance. And for them, the prognosis is much, much worse. There's a real risk of sudden cardiac death.
And if that's not enough, there's even a cardiac syndrome Z. This one directly connects obstructive sleep apnea, or OSA, with a nasty four-part combo of heart risks: belly fat, insulin resistance, high blood pressure, and high cholesterol. We're starting to realize that OSA isn't just a snoring problem or a sleep disorder. It's a full-blown cardiac disease. It's another perfect example of how a systemic issue can wreak havoc on the heart, very often by damaging this delicate microvascular system. So, now that we're armed with this new understanding of both the big and the small vessels, we can start to finally tackle some of the other really strange, lingering mysteries in cardiology.
All right, let's dive into two kind of advanced concepts here. First is something called myocardial hibernation. This happens when there's a chronic lack of blood flow. The heart muscle isn't getting what it needs, so it's not working right. But, and this is key, it's still alive. It's basically gone into a low-power hibernation mode to survive. If you can restore blood flow, it can wake back up. Then there's myocardial stunning. This is totally different. It's an acute thing. It happens after you've successfully restored blood flow, like after putting in a stent to open up an artery. The heart muscle is basically dazed and confused. It's stunned from the whole ordeal. It still doesn't work right for a little while, even though the blood supply is back. It just needs time to recover and wake up. All of this is completely changing how we think about risk factors, too. It's not just about your total cholesterol number anymore. I mean, smoking? It's still the single most important preventable risk factor, period. Why? Because it just damages the entire cardiovascular system top to bottom. And when we do talk about cholesterol, we now know it's the small, dense LDL particles, not just total LDL, that are the really dangerous artery-clogging kind. We're also getting smarter about measuring inflammation, which is the fire that drives this whole disease. We can look at things like high-sensitivity C-reactive protein, hsCRP, for a direct snapshot. And then there's this really fascinating paradox that researchers are uncovering. In some cases, severe malnutrition can actually kick inflammation into overdrive and, weirdly enough, increase cardiovascular risk. So at the end of the day, after looking at the classic story, diving into this new world of the microvessels, and exploring all these clinical paradoxes, we're kind of left with a sense of profound humility. We've learned so much, and yet that central mystery, what is the exact trigger for that fatal plaque rupture? It's still out of our grasp. This quote really says it all. The real crux part behind this is somewhere where our understanding is still far from complete, and that's what makes this so incredibly important. It shows us just how much we still have to learn, and why this is one of the most exciting and urgent frontiers in all of medical research.